Okay, so hi everyone, nice to be here. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Islandora Workbench. Islandora Workbench is a tool for managing content in an Islandora repository. And it is not the only tool you can use to do this. The standard tool is the Drupal migrate framework. And throughout this brief presentation, I might kind of compare and contrast the two a couple of places. But basically, you would use Workbench to do some of the following things against your Islandora repository. Create objects plus their metadata, so an entire object that is the metadata, the fielded metadata, and the payload files, the PDFs, the images, and whatnot. That applies to both single file objects of any type and compound objects and page content, books and whatnot. You can create both. You can create only the meta nodes with just the metadata if you want, and you can also later on add media to those existing nodes, or you can add additional media to nodes that already have media. You can update existing nodes. You can delete nodes and media. The overall philosophy of Workbench is the simple things should be simple and the difficult things should be possible. Adopting that from the Perl community. And one of the not difficult but more complex things is integrating Workbench with other applications. And I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation a brief example of one of those integrations that we're doing at Simon Fraser University, or going to do. It's not live yet, but it will be a live show. And Workbench can do a lot more. So why would you use Workbench and not Drupal migrate? In a word, Workbench is simpler than migrate in most cases. And most importantly, and the chief motivation for developing Workbench, to be honest, is that you can run it from anywhere, any computer, as long as that computer has HTTP access to your Drupal, your Drupal repository or your Islandora repository. You can run Workbench from there. By contrast, the Drupal migrate framework, you can only run it, as far as I know, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, only run it from the Drupal server's command shell. And that is a barrier to some people, depending on how the Drupal and Islandora repository is deployed and the kind of user that is wanting to manage content in the repository. So the typical user for Workbench wouldn't need access to the Drupal server's command shell. So that means that content like digitization people, metadata people, repository managers who may not be allowed to access the Drupal server's command shell because of local security policies. And this is becoming more and more common as universities in particular, but other institutions as well, other kinds of organizations become much more security conscious. It's getting more and more difficult to get command line access to virtual machines and other kinds of servers unless you're a developer or sysadmin. The input to Workbench, its input data is a single CSV file or a Google Sheet or an Excel file. And optionally, if you want to create complete objects with metadata and payload files like PDFs and images and whatnot, you need to have those files as well. But basically, everything that you're putting into your repository is expressed in a single CSV file or equivalent Google Sheet or Excel file. Workbench only requires one configuration file as opposed to migrate. The one configuration file can be super simple, like I'll show you in a minute, or it can be super complex depending on what you're trying to do and what defaults that Workbench provides that you want to override. So in general, Workbench, there's a lot of configuration options, let's say 40 or something, making that up, but it's something like that. It provides sensible defaults or commonly used defaults. But if you want to override any of those defaults, then you'll need to add a setting or an option to your configuration file, and I'll illustrate that in a few minutes. Workbench provides robust data validation. I'll also demonstrate in a minute that you can point Workbench at a CSV file and it will validate to the extent possible without actually ingesting the content in that CSV file into Islandora or into Drupal. It will validate that the data that's in your CSV file is going to work. And it will warn you if there is something you should look at or be aware of before you pull the trigger and move beyond the validation stage and into the commit stage where you're actually pushing content into Islandora. Workbench is as well documented as I can make it, and people who suggest improvements to the documentation. It's got its own documentation site, which I might show later on if there's time in the question period. And I'm always happy to get feedback on the documentation. It's an important aspect of the work I do is documenting my code well. And as I said a minute ago, Workbench can be integrated into a variety of content production and maintenance workflows, automated, semi-automated, and you know, whatever you want to do. It can basically, you can probably figure out a way to integrate Workbench into your workflow. At Workbench is under very active development, and some of the things it can't do fully or at all at the moment, but are high on the feature list because people are asking for them. Include creating multiple media projects. So instead of just adding one file, like the file that you would tag in an ordinary Islandora as the original file, you can also add other files like custom thumbnails, like pre-generated OCR transcripts and things of that nature. That's under active development now, is very close to being complete, and will be a very useful feature of Workbench, particularly when you're using Workbench as part of a migration from another platform, whether it's Islandora 7 or Content TM or whatever. You may not want to regenerate all that OCR in Islandora, or if you have custom thumbnails in your existing repository, you may not want to regenerate those custom thumbnails because they're custom, they're not regeneratable from existing files. So that'll be very useful. Another feature that people have been asking for, and up until recently I thought was impossible, but may not be impossible due to an awesome community contribution by Nat from the University of Toronto at Scarborough, is multilingual metadata creation. So this is where you have one node and you use Drupal's built-in translation features to provide field level translations in other languages. Paragraph fields, I'm not that familiar with paragraph, but it is used in the community, and someone's asking if we can support paragraph fields, and yes, we likely can, and that's on the short-term roadmap. Something that we have used at Simon Fraser University over the years in another Drupal repository site, not an Islandora site, but just an ordinary Drupal repository site, is the ability to clone existing objects, and we're going to want to use that at Simon Fraser for a variety of purposes. And while Islandora Workbench is currently a command line tool, it is completely possible, and it is my intention to one day have a graphical user interface for it. Although I have to say that with the ability to use Google Sheet, I think the demand for the GUI is maybe a little bit less than it was initially, but that's something that we want to have and something we need to have to further to make Workbench even more accessible to more people. Some of the challenges that I'm encountering as the developer of Workbench and the chief maintainer is keeping up with Drupal. This has been challenging because Drupal 8 and to a lesser extent 9 are kind of moving targets. There are major features that Workbench needs in Drupal that just aren't ready. Translation, support for translation over REST is one of them. So because Workbench interacts with Drupal via HTTP, so let's call it REST, it uses the standard, in almost every case, uses the standard REST interfaces that Drupal provides. A couple of very small exceptions that are provided by a required module called Islandora Workbench Integration, but that's kind of minor, in fact. But the real APIs that Workbench communicates with Drupal using are the standard Drupal REST interfaces, and they've been a moving target for some time. Keeping up with Islandora is not so hard because Islandora is fairly stable now, but that as Islandora evolves, Workbench will also need to evolve to keep up with it. part of the technical liability or debt in using Drupal's REST interfaces is that fields, like fields you would use you configure in an Islandora object, they're not treated all the same way in the context of the REST interface. So that means that to push content up into a field, Workbench needs to know precisely how to format that, how to structure that content into a JSON container that it can then push up into Drupal. And the challenge here is that 80% of fields use a single structure, and then every other field uses its own structure. So getting back to the paragraphs field type example for a minute, that's going to require some coding within Workbench to convert the content that's coming from the CSV into the specific structures that the paragraph field type requires, and that structure is what Workbench will then need to compile in real time when you're running it and push up into Drupal. So this is only a problem because Drupal is infinitely configurable and infinitely extensible. So when someone creates a really awesome new field type for use in the Islandora community, then Workbench will need to be aware of that and need to adapt to be able to support it. But I've written Workbench in a way that it is relatively easy to add new field types. You need to be a developer and understand Python code and Python object-oriented code, but it's possible to do it without hacking the core of Workbench. And finally, supporting users is not only awesome and gratifying, but it's also challenging because Drupal is infinitely configurable and extensible. And if you've asked for support on Slack or on an issue in the Workbench issue queue, you almost invariably hear me ask, can you give me your configuration file and your CSV file? Because I need to be able to replicate your problem in order to help fix it. And that works almost all the time. But if you're configuring your Islandora in some custom way, then I'm going to be challenged to replicate that configuration locally. So eventually I'll be asking you to go in and dump field types, field configurations and whatnot, so I can then use them in my local copy of Islandora to help figure out what's going on. When I say supporting users is challenging, I want you to contact me if you want support. I'm just saying it's because Drupal is so configurable and Islandora is so configurable, it's sometimes challenging to replicate your environment on my laptop so that then I can replicate your problem and fix it. So I'm going to do a demo in a second. Erin, am I kind of on track for time?
Yeah, you're good to go. You've
Okay,
got time.
Super. So using Workbench, again, it's a command line tool. But all you need to know is under number 3 there, run Workbench. That's kind of the only command you need to be able to run, those 2 commands. And same command 1 with an optional flag check at the end there. But you need to first create a CSV file, and this is your metadata. So the one I've created here has got 3 items in it, and it wraps the first row is the header row, the second row is the first data row, and it wraps because it's to fit it on the screen. I'll explain what these fields are in a second. 2 other rows at the bottom there. Again, the top row is the column heading row, and a couple of fields identified here are reserved by Workbench. You can't name fields using these names because they're reserved, but you wouldn't normally need to anyway. File is reserved, and it is the location. It is the column that contains the file name or file path or URL. If you want to reference a file that's available on the web via HTTP, you can do that as long as it doesn't require authentication at the moment. So that's your file. So these are all images, JPEGs. ID is just it's not a meaningful ID necessarily. You can use whatever you want in this column. It is used internally to Workbench only. It's not part of your metadata. That ends up in your nodes, like as a field of data. However, you can use whatever you want here, which means you can also use, if you have a piece of metadata called identifier, you can use that here. and you get to rename which field is used as your ID field. It's a configuration option. It wouldn't be used very often in real life, probably, but the default is ID, but you can call it identifier, you can call it PID, you can call it whatever you want by using a configuration option, which I'll get to in a few seconds. Title is a standard Drupal field. You can't change that name. It's part of every Drupal node. In fact, it's the only required field in Drupal. Nothing to do with Islandora. It's the only required field in Drupal. So that's that. If you're using title in your Islandora content type as the title, then you would put it here. Field model, field description, and field subject, those are fields that are specific to or used in this case, I'm using the this demo and running a Workbench here is populating nodes of content type Islandora repository. So the default. So the fields, field model, field description, and field subject, those are all, they come with Islandora defaults as part of that content type. And you, as you can see here, you just put information in the CSV like you would any other CSV, following the exact same rules you would for any standard CSV file. So in other words, you have it's comma delimited in this case, so use commas to delimit the fields. If a field contains a comma, you must escape it with double quotation marks. The CSV files are standard classic CSV files as far as the structure goes. And they can be produced from any application that can spit out CSV files, preferably in UTF-8 encoding, so that you can encode non-Latin characters in your data. So even though the CSV files, the structure of the CSV files is completely standard, the structure of the data within the fields is not completely standard in all cases. And that's because CSV is a flat structure. There's no really standard way to represent a hierarchy or multi-part data in CSV. So when you look at things like, the image file name or the title or, the description in the first entry, view from Deep Cove to Burnaby Mountain, that's just text, no biggie. If the view from Deep Cove to Burnaby Mountain contained a comma, you would need to either escape it or wrap that in double quotation marks. The last field is weird looking, right? You wouldn't expect to see it. But what it does is this field subject is a field that is linked to 3 or 4 taxonomies, the Drupal taxonomies. So in other words, when you're populating field subject field in the Drupal's graphical user interface, you are typing ahead or selecting from a list in some way of entries that are in the linked vocabularies. Doing this in CSV using Workbench, if the field you're populating is only linked to one vocabulary, then you don't need to do anything. You just put in either a label like this one, Burnaby, British Columbia, or a term ID, 110. Doesn't matter. Or you can even use a URI if you've configured your taxonomy terms to use linked data URIs. You can use a linked data URI in this field as well. But if, in the case, as is in the case with the standard Islandora repository object configuration, the subject field is linked to 4 or 5 different vocabularies, and you're adding new vocabulary terms on the fly. So in this case, I'm adding Burnaby, British Columbia doesn't exist in my taxonomies, but I want to add it. So I'm populating my spreadsheet and my CSV file with taxonomy terms in the fields that I want to populate them with. And I'm using the labels because they don't exist yet. Islandora Workbench will create the taxonomy term on the fly for you. I will only create it once if you use it multiple times, using kind of soft, fuzzy pattern text string matching to make sure that you don't recreate the same term unnecessarily. If the geolocation colon tag there is necessary because you need to tell Workbench if you're adding Burnaby, British Columbia as a taxonomy term, and the field subject is linked to multiple vocabularies, You need to tell Drupal which vocabulary to add it to. That's all it does. You're going to see this pattern a few times in Workbench if you get into it at all. There are a number of field types in Drupal that require a little bit of structure in the CSV data that you're populating them with, because those field types require more than just the taxonomy term label. They require other things, and this is an example of that. So you have a CSV file, and let's assume that that's kind of straightforward and standard, apart from the weird conventions that Workbench enforces on you to represent complex data. Second step is to create a configuration file. The only required settings in this configuration file are task, host, username, and password. Everything else is optional. It's optional because because Workbench gives you defaults. In the case of my little configuration file here, depicted under the number 2 step, I'm not using the standard CSV file name. The standard CSV file name is called metadata.csv, and I'm using a custom file name called summer.csv. The allow adding terms true. By default, Workbench does not let you add new terms to your vocabularies. If you try to do that, it'll say, sorry, I'm not going to do that. You have to go into your configuration file and add this option if you want to do it. And that's because you can mess up your repository pretty badly if by accident. If you can't mess it up, you're just going to be adding a lot of vocabulary terms which you may not want to add, and you have the problem of getting rid of them or whatever. So you've got to go in and set this to true in order to add new taxonomy terms on the fly in your CSV. Run Workbench is the final step, and you will end up doing this over and over again because you will no doubt want to test your configuration and your data. But even though it's not required, it is very, very highly recommended that you ask Workbench to validate your data before you commit it. If you run Workbench --config and then the name of your file, and in this case, summer YAML is the name of the file that's depicted in step number 2. It's not going to check your data. It's just going to do it. In many cases, it will fail gracefully and keep on going if it encounters a problem. In some cases, it will just stop dead and say, you got to fix this first. I'm not going to go any further. But if you give it the check parameter, then it will not add anything to your Drupal or Islandora. It'll just check or validate the data that's in your CSV file and validate the presence of your image files and PDFs or whatever, and make sure that your Drupal is configured properly to work with Workbench. Now I'm going to demonstrate this, and of course this is exactly when my cat wants attention and it's in front of my laptop. So, okay, so you should see a terminal.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Now can you see a little Drupal Islandora? Or still the terminal?
Terminal still.
Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing again just to show you my little test Islandora. So this is Islandora running in an Islandora Ansible playbook on my local laptop. Again, I'm running it locally just because it's convenient to do so. This could be any Islandora that I have an account on that has sufficient privileges to create content. But it's running at localhost, but it could be running anywhere, including a production Islandora. It's only one node in it, translation test, but it is completely unrelated to this demo, so ignore it. I just want to demonstrate that there's nothing really in my Islandora repository other than this one node. I think this will be the last time that I will just swap back and forth. So I have a configuration file called summer, and there it is. It's the same file I just showed you a minute ago in my screen snapshot. As you can see, the task is what you're asking Islandora Workbench to do for you. So the tasks are create, delete, update, add media. Yeah, that's the only ones that exist. Delete media. And there's a credentials there for my user who is going to be actually ingesting the content. required parameter of the Workbench script is config, and you're just going to point it at the configuration file, in this case, Summer. And I, following my own advice, to always validate my my job before I commit to it. I'm going to do that. And so we're going to see some scary looking stuff here, but it's not that scary looking. It's just warning. Again, this step in using Workbench is it doesn't modify your Drupal or your Islandora. It queries it to ask it, do these terms exist? You know, does this user identified in in the configuration file have sufficient permissions and things of that nature, just to make sure that when you do commit, the chance that you've already eliminated a bunch of errors or anticipated them and have done, and your work will be much more successful. So it's saying everything is okay, and as you can see, it kind of does the things you want. It checks your CSV file to make sure it has the same number of columns as headers, and that all the files that are needed exist, and things of that nature. The warnings here are around the taxonomy terms that are used in the CSV, and they're just telling you that you got to confirm something. There is a Workbench leaves a log. This one's probably too long to be useful, but you can see that the warnings here are telling us, okay, you're populating a field subject that has multiple vocabularies linked to it. And it's asking, unfortunately, the way that Drupal's REST interfaces work, they give the same response if either so this is a view. So Workbench is querying a view here to get all of the fields sorry, all of the terms in a vocabulary. And unfortunately, the view gives the same response if a vocabulary is not in the view, and if it also has 0 terms in it. You may want to change that by creating a custom view or something, but the way that the standard view works is that it gives an empty list. You ask it for all the terms in corporate body, and if corporate body is not registered in that view, it'll give an empty list, not a 404 not found or something. So this is kind of why it's challenging to kind of keep up with or accommodate Drupal's idiosyncrasies and quirks, because they are numerous and troublesome. This is one of them. Now that I've satisfied that, you know, I'm satisfied that my vocabularies are all okay, I'm going to commit. And when I do this, it's actually no longer in check mode. It is going to modify my Drupal by pushing up creating nodes by pushing up the content in my CSV file and the JPEG images I've identified in the file column. So this is quite a bit slower than the check phase. And in fact, one of the ways we can improve Workbench is to make it faster. We could do things like push up, parallelize creation of nodes, and that would work. Oops, got a problem there. So the media for Amsterdam Waterfront didn't get created for some reason. That'd be interesting to look in the log and see what happened. But you're interacting here with a live Drupal, and it's likely that if we, parallelize the job of pushing up content to a Drupal, it would actually crash the Drupal. So we worked around that. I'm going to go back to my Islandora and show it to you to demonstrate that it actually did create some nodes. So there are the nodes that it created at Alcatraz Island, for example. If I look at the bird in that one, it will have the subject. And there's the subject. For some reason, there are plus signs after it. That's a mistake in my CSV file, I'm sure. Yeah, so this is Workbench creating nodes. Let's look at the So at the end, I noted that the image for the Amsterdam Waterfront node didn't get pushed up. And I'm looking at my log file where Workbench will have logged a specific error. And it's a specific error. Here it's a HTTP status code of 500, but that's very general, so I still don't know what the problem was. But I'd have to look in my, my Drupal error logs to see what happened. I won't do that now, but just because it would take quite some time probably. But this is telling me, or telling someone who is able to figure out what's wrong here. There was an error. The image, the file didn't get created. The media didn't get created. And this is the error code that Drupal replied with. So this is just maybe a good illustration of how the log works.
I can't see the log, Mark. It's still the Drupal site.
Oh, yeah, that's because, thanks. That's because I. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So getting back to, yeah, so at the bottom of the log there, the third last row, it says error, file not created, post request to, that's the URL that Workbench is using, returned an error code of 500. So again, not a lot of information. All it would really help us with is telling us if someone needs to go look at the error logs, Drupal error logs, to figure out why it failed. But that's something. I'm going to go back to my presentation. So that, in a nutshell, was a brief demo of Workbench in action with a very simple CSV file. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, I want to show you a simple integration that it's not so simple, but it's a useful integration that we'll be using at Simon Fraser. And this is just an overview of it here. In the next slide, I'll show you exactly how it works. But if all you want to do is load content using Workbench, like I did just there, that is to say, you prepare a CSV file and you just run it to batch ingest objects. That's fine. That's what it's for. Its primary purpose. But if you also want to do things like auto-generate the CSV file and the PDFs, for example, from another application, you can do that. And this is the exact, and then interact with that application in specific ways. This is exactly the use case that we have at Simon Fraser, and that is we have an application that is used by graduate students to submit their theses, and then it is used by the thesis office, which is in the library at SFU, to audit, that is, approve the thesis for publication. And it's called the Thesis Registration System, or TRS, locally in its abbreviated form. So the TRS is an application, and it's a web app. It's not Islandora. It's just a custom web app. It's sitting over in the upper left-hand corner of this diagram. In this diagram, ignore everything to the right of the blue line. That's a separate parallel workflow. And the reason I include it here is that the TRS daily script does two things. It runs daily, like at midnight or something, or 11 p.m., and it dumps out a variety of data for two different workflows. One of them is Islandora based. It will populate our institutional repository with the theses that were approved that day. So if it runs at 11 p.m., every thesis that was approved since the last 11 p.m. approval or period is, let's say in the previous working day, is eligible to be automatically ingested into our institutional repository. The workflow on the right is a monthly job that takes all of the metadata for all the theses published in that month and in the previous month, and converts them to MARC records, which are then automatically emailed to our metadata department, which is called RAM, Resource Access Metadata and Management. That's the division in the library. But it is the workflow on the left-hand side of the blue bar that I want to just describe here before I sign off. So this TRS daily script runs daily. It dumps out the metadata and the payload files, like the PDF of the thesis, and any supplemental files the students attach, like a Excel spreadsheet or a video file or what have you. And it dumps them out in a kind of a directory-based structure. Each of the theses gets its own subdirectory, and within that subdirectory is the PDF and then any other files that exist. to be ingested into the institutional repository. So Workbench is the means by which we will be ingesting content into our Islandora-based IR. So Workbench is going to be scheduled to run automatically later than 11 p.m. So let's say 4 a.m. or something. That it will run just like I did a minute ago using the command line, but it will do so in a cron job on the server. And the configuration file is going to point to the location of the CSV file that the TRS Islandora Workbench converter, the node there in the middle, generates. So that script runs after 11 o'clock, after the thesis have been dumped from the TRS, but before Islandora Workbench is scheduled to run. And that script, its sole purpose is to take the data for the daily batch of theses and convert it into a CSV file and files like file structure that Workbench understands. And the CSV file will look very much like the little three-item CSV file that I demonstrated a few minutes ago. So that job runs and creates the input data in effect for Islandora Workbench. That happens at say 2 a.m. and then at 4 a.m. Islandora Workbench runs in this scheduled job and it ingests content into Summit. The integration, so there's two integrations with applications going on here. One is an incoming data from the thesis registration system, and it undergoes a bit of a pipeline there. As I illustrate, there's a script that runs it, dumps it, then there's a script that runs it, transforms it into the input format required by Workbench. And then the last integration is the other direction. Islandora Workbench can be configured to run a custom script, one or more custom scripts that fire on the successful creation of a node, of an object. So if Islandora Workbench successfully ingests an object into Islandora, then you can configure it to, at that point, on successful creation of an object, run a script using the node ID, the newly minted node ID of the new object that it just created, and other data that's available to Workbench in that environment. And in this case, in this particular integration, what this does is once a student's thesis is approved, we don't want that student logging back into the TRS to change the metadata, because once it gets approved, it is like it's synced, it's finalized. That metadata gets pushed over into the IR, and later on that month, a MARC record gets generated for that thesis. It gets into the catalog. So we don't want them messing around with their data, their metadata or their files after the thesis office has approved the thesis for publication. So what we've configured Workbench to do is there's a little REST interface running on the TRS that it will basically disable the student's login account on the TRS. So that means that, so to summarize, what happens in Workbench is if the thesis object is created successfully in our IR, then Workbench is aware of that fact and it's also aware of the thesis ID and whatnot. And this little custom script is nothing but a simple HTTP script that will go and post to an API on the TRS to disable that student's account. So that student cannot log in anymore unless they contact the thesis office and explain why they want to log in. So that probably wasn't very clear, but it's a kind of a more than trivial integration of Workbench into an automated workflow. And I think this is my last slide. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about anything that I've covered today. Thank you.
Mark, I don't know if you saw Seth just asked, can you show how to structure a typed relation field for the Workbench?
Sure. Seth, by show, how would you like me to do this? Can I just go to the documentation and cover that, or do you want me to actually run it?
However you would like.
Okay, let me just go to, I was lucky, well, I guess Danny and I were both unlucky since something unexpected happened during our demos. So not to tempt fate, what I want to do is I'm going to go to the documentation and show that. Right, so this is the Islandora Workbench documentation. And in the section called Drupal fields and CSV fields, a long, complex section, because this is where the strange syntax that I alluded to earlier is documented. Strange because you need to include structured data in a CSV file field. Type relation that Seth is asking about is another of these fields that requires a little bit of structure in its input data for a couple of reasons. One is by default, and I think most users will use taxonomies as the type of entity that is configured in a typed relation. Seth, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can also use nodes. I think, but you would typically use taxonomies to indicate, say, names, and then the names are the type relation part of the field type identifies for the use of that taxonomy term, let's say a name, in that field. Here is the type of relationship that name, the entity described in the name, the person, has with this object, this work. So a book author, a photographer of a photo, an editor of a book, and things of that nature. So to express this in CSV, you need to do two things. If you look at the here, this is a screen snapshot from the standard configuration for the linked agent typed relation field that ships with Drupal defaults. And you can see that there's a namespace. Relators is the marked relators vocabulary. That's what relators : means. At the end, you see art copyist, art director, and so forth. Those are the human readable labels that are associated with this relator value. The relator values are the things in the middle, the ACP, ADI, ART, and so forth. And within one of those linked type relation fields, all three pieces of information are encoded, or at least the namespace and the relator are. So to express that in a CSV file, you need to tell Workbench, okay, I'm populating this field, this say linked agent field, and I want to populate it with a value that expresses the namespace, the relator, and the target for the value. In this case here, and pardon me for it's pretty small, but this case here, relators art 30. This is the same information that I'm seeing up here. The relators art, and then the 30 is the term ID of the value of the target that I want to use in that particular typed relation field. If I want to use, so this is the term ID 30 for someone named Mark Jordan. If I don't want to bother with using a term ID, or I want to add a term ID on the fly, I can use the label, like the textual human readable label for that term. If I want to add Jordan Common Mark as a taxonomy entry, a term, but the field that I'm populating has is linked to more than one taxonomy, I need to do something similar to what I showed you in my demo, which is identify the taxonomy name that this new term should go into. In this case, this is how you do it here. Relators, comma, a colon art. So we've already done that because this is the mark relator and the relator abbreviation or code that we want to use. But now I'm adding Jordan, comma, Mark as a brand new entry into my person taxonomy. So in that case, I need to identify which taxonomy I want Workbench to create it in, and it's the person vocabulary or taxonomy. So as you can see, this is getting a little bit complex, right? So this is why, because you have the very structured values that have separated by colons, and then have the values that are in each space, each part of the structured value, relators, art, person, they all need to be valid. Like Drupal needs to understand that. So this is why the check phase, the validation phase of Workbench is so important, because it will tell you, I understand all these things you're telling me, even though they're kind of complex in structure, everything should work. If it doesn't understand some of these bits, it's going to tell you, I don't understand that. It's probably an error. Can you please fix? Yeah, so that's how you would populate a typed relation value using Workbench.
There's a few questions just in the chat here, Mark. I don't know if you wanted to look at them. There's one a little further up from Yamil. It says, can the input CSV file handle new lines in the content? Excuse me. I think I have some new lines in some description fields.
Yes, it can. It's standard CSV. It uses Python's standard CSV reader library, and it's a good quality library. So you can put anything in the CSV file that is valid CSV. But one thing you need to note, or people need to note, is you can also put markup in there. So if you want to put HTML markup in your fields, in your field values, you can do that, and Workbench will populate those fields as is without modifying your input data at all. But because Drupal handles markup in values differently depending on how that field is configured. This is mainly for security reasons, but also just to limit the kinds of tags that authors can stick into HTML tags that authors can put into a field. Because if you put certain tags in there, it's going to break things. It's not going to render properly, probably. And there's a lot of security issues with that as well. You can put markup in there, but it will populate. Workbench will populate that field, but you will need. It's up to you to ensure that the field is configured properly to render your markup. But yes, Emil, you can add new lines as long as I think in that case you must wrap your CSV in double quotes. I think that's how CSV expects new lines to work.
Cool. And there's another, if you've got, Christina's got another, there's a question in there about length of, oh yeah, I was gonna say, you want to, you go right ahead.
It might be better than trying to read the chat. I know a number of folks, and Lyricist included, are doing things to get around the 255 character limit on title, because often the titles are too long. And I think people are doing that differently, but it usually is like defining another field to put your title in and then automatically deriving the Drupal title from that. So I was just wondering, does that then preclude you from using Workbench because it requires that Drupal title, or is there a way to handle that?
Not currently, because no one has asked for it, but it's totally doable, I think. Title is required by Drupal no matter what. Like it doesn't let you. Well, I mean, if you use one of there's a couple of contrib modules that will let you work around this limitation of 255 characters. I don't know how they handle it, but in any case, if you don't want to include a value in the title column, then we can accommodate that in Workbench. It would take a little bit of work, and I would ask you for some use cases and testing and whatnot, Christina, but yeah, we can do that. I'd likely need another configuration option because most people are going to want to use title. I understand people who can't for that limitation reason. But if we make title optional by default, Drupal's not going to be happy. If we require a configuration option that says title equivalent or something, then Workbench could even create the titles for you on the fly. If we can agree on rules for deriving the title, or the node Drupal level node title from the value you supply in, the title field that you're identifying in your CSV. So short answer is yes. Long answer is it will take a little work, but that's fine. That's why we're here.
I think one use case that we could probably use for that is in Workbench, have a field that says copy from field. So you say, here's another field in my CSV that has the longer title, and I'm just going to copy it and trim it to 255. So it's no longer than that. Because that's essentially what a lot of these other modules are doing, is taking some other field, trimming it, and stashing it in there. So I think that would be a reasonable approach for the Workbench side.
Yeah, it totally would be. And that's thanks, Seth. That's a pretty simple implementation of that solution. So we could do that. I mean, if you wanted to do something different, then there is already than what Seth just described. There's already a mechanism in Workbench to modify. Like you have to write a script to do it, but it will take that script and for every value in a field, it will apply the value in the field. You'll apply that script to the value in the field. So in other words, it's kind of a pre-processor. So you can already do that if you want to take the trouble to write a little custom script to do it. But the default behavior, I think what you're describing, Seth, to satisfy Christina's use case, that's a completely reasonable and generalizable solution, yeah. So if one of you guys wants to open an issue on the Workbench queue, we can work through this.
Great, thank you. I asked because the metadata interest group had been talking about doing something like that for Islandora defaults, and we would hate to do something that then made it impossible for folks to use Workbench. So sounds good.
The only things that make it impossible to use Workbench are limitations in Drupal's REST interfaces. So I want to be able to accommodate any data you can throw at Workbench, as long as you can use the REST existing REST interface to push it into Drupal, which is probably going to be the case. Yeah, that's the title of the hard-coded maximum length of the Drupal title is something that doesn't really fit with using Drupal as a basis for a content repository. Sure, different ways to address it.
Awesome. Do we have anything else? Anybody have anything else for Mark, Danny?
I guess I have one other question. We have been working on a suite of new field types to support more like flexible metadata, and just wondering if there is like something we should do to make it more transparent, like or make, what am I asking? Like to work with you or to provide the documentation to like make things more supportable. Like, is there something we can do with like the schema of a field type and the properties of a field to create a more standard way of working with different field types in Workbench, or what would you advise?
Yeah, totally. I'm unaware of a way to get so the Workbench converts from CSV to JSON and then pushes that JSON. It adds a JSON to a larger aggregate of JSON, which is the node. Like it's the JSON structure of the node, and then pushes that whole thing up into Drupal using Drupal's REST interface with JSON as the structure. So all I need to know is for your custom field types is what kind of JSON structure does Drupal expect? And the way that I've been doing that so far is like installing any contrib modules I need and then populating them using the GUI, using Drupal's GUI tools, and then getting the object and inspecting the JSON structure that comes back, because that is the structure that then I need to replicate. I need to create and wrap the CSV data in to push up to Workbench. That's a pretty inefficient and simple way of doing it. If there are tools that let me or anyone get the JSON structure of a field programmatically or via some kind of an API documenter or whatever, I could use that. But in the absence of that kind of tool, what I would do, Christina, is I would ask you for like the module where you're implementing this custom field type. I would install it, I would populate a couple, I would inspect them, and then just go from there to try to replicate that data, that structure, JSON structure. A major rewrite of Workbench happened a little while ago where I implemented field types as Python objects, which means it is possible for a developer to write some Python code that will implement a new field type and just drop in the like the Python code into a file, and it should work right away. There's no other configuration, no nothing. So some combination of me writing that code or someone like Nigel writing it and contributing it to Workbench, something like that would have to happen, but it's totally doable. The only awkward part is where your field type is going to require complex data, like the type relation that I showed and the vocabularies. Then we need to kind of agree on how do we express that. If you're requiring a user to provide that data, then we need to agree on a convention to structure it within the CSV column. And the pattern I've established so far is all the bits need to be in a certain order and separated by colons. And I'd like to kind of pick one and stick with it, but if that doesn't fit your custom field types, we can work that out.